where in this beautiful world you're listening from. This is Michael Cross with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Now, before we begin, there's always that little plug I do at the beginning, and that is if you'd like to see articles that I have published on a wide range of issues, mostly centered around society and psychology and issues like advertising and so forth and individuality, then go to my website at michaelcross.net. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's PsychoMike777. And check out my YouTube station at Michael Cross. And you'll have all of the earlier shows that I've done and much more. Anyway, tonight what I would like to deal with is this whole issue that is dominating news today, and that is ISIS and terrorism and so forth. Now, I'm not going to get into really ISIS for a while, but I'd like to give a historical background. Don't start switching things off when you hear history. This is not like your high school lessons where, you get some boring facts and figures. History is worthless unless you tie it together with what is going on in the present day, and even using it as a way of predicting the future. But most importantly, we need to see the connections or you can't understand anything. That would be like trying to diagnose someone's heart ailment by just, looking at their tongue. Sure, you might get a few indications here or there, but it doesn't work like on TV. You need to have a lot more diagnostic devices to help you find out what is wrong with someone's heart. So therefore, you need to be able to, find out what connects to what, where the proverbial thread goes through. So stick with this for a few minutes and see exactly where it goes. You might be surprised. Anyway, most people see history as something or an event today, and they're only looking in the context of, explain it simple. We're a population that wants answers quick. We don't want to research, really, most people. Maybe the people listening to this broadcast are different, obviously, but the majority of people just want quick and easy answers. Black and white. The good guys wearing the white hats, bad guys wearing the black hats. That's the way the movies are from America, and that influences the world. But it's also it's promoted in the news. It's promoted everywhere. And you see, life is not so simple. And what I'd like to do is, we could go back to World War I and even before that. But what I'd like to do is start in the era when the Cold War started. That's right. The Cold War has a lot to do with ISIS. It has a lot to do with Al-Qaeda. And let me explain the connections. Okay. First off, after the war ended, that era that everyone was hoping would be this peace after the Nazis and the Japanese were defeated, quickly turned sour when the West and the East sort of faced off against each other. It wasn't a shooting war for the most part. It was just a competition for countries around the world. A lot of countries wound up becoming independent. A lot of countries in the developing, what we consider the developing world, and you wound up with a lot of countries, gaining their independence from colonial grip. England and France, for the most part, lost their empires. Well, at least on paper. I mean, they kept their business connections. And again, countries that were dominated by all of these old empires that lasted for hundreds of years gained independence and got to start afresh. Now, at the same time, we had the Western powers facing off. We had NATO formed, which was designed to keep in check the Soviet Union. And the Warsaw Pact formed. Basically, to protect themselves from NATO. I'm giving you their perspective. I mean, in the American press or history books, often it makes it look like Warsaw Pact was formed and then they just started wanting to face off. But basically, both sides were kind of staring at each other, thinking they were right. And so this sets the stage for something that became a worldwide struggle. Now, for those of you that don't remember or were too young to know about this, communism, or Soviet communism in particular, after World War II, and well before that, but I promise not to get before that, but Soviet communism was dedicated to the eradication of such things as private property, very totalitarian. Now, totalitarian differs from authoritarian because totalitarians want you to accept the system that you live under and believe in it, versus an authoritarian doesn't care what you believe as long as they can step on you if you get out of line. A lot of the quasi-fascist movements that took hold in Latin America, for instance, were more authoritarian. But anyway, the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state. It was also very negative to religion. Okay, the state religion was atheism. People had to hide their faith. And got to admire those people when communism fell and suddenly the churches were filled again. That was admirable that for 70 years they were able to maintain their faith in secret. Many of them government officials that were enforcing these rules were religious but just didn't want to admit it. Now, the thing that's interesting is that while everyone's kind of aware of what was going on in Europe and, you know, the whole Soviet Union versus NATO, they're not usually aware that this conflict, this competition was taking place in places like the Middle East as well. Now, when a lot of countries wound up getting more freedom, when the French and the British could no longer really control them, there was a sense amongst many that the Arab peoples wanted to become more nationalistic. Now, what I mean by nationalism is different than European nationalism for the most part. European nationalism sort of said in the 19th century that, you know, if you're born in Germany, you're a German, and you should see a certain loyalty to your government and to those things German. Okay, that was German nationalism. The French had nationalism. The Italians had nationalism. And it served the purpose of uniting a lot of these provinces that before had basically been like semi-independent provinces. But when you became one country and then tried to fuse them all together, I mean, if you look at Italy, you know, the very north of Italy is very different than if you go down to Sicily. But with nationalism, you try to create an identity. The Arabs had an identity, and much of that's based on religion, yes, but there was a common sense of what it meant to be Arab, similar to a large degree how we see Hispanics. Okay, the definition of Hispanic in the United States is just having been born in a country that is of Spanish origin, ultimately, if you go back far enough. And that could include being born in Spain or Portugal. But it could also mean that you could be some blonde, blue-eyed Irish descendant living in Chile, or you could be black living in Brazil. Either way, you're seen as Hispanic. You know, it's a common language and a certain cultural identity. Now, with the Arabs, again, we're talking about a people who are not necessarily completely ethnically the same. Okay, a northern Sudanese person is much different than a Moroccan, and a Moroccan may be different than a Saudi Arabian. But because of the Arab conquest that came out of that area, you know, Saudi Arabia and Yemen, today, during when Muhammad and his armies spread out carrying Islam, the people were pretty much put under kind of a similar cultural identity. And to a large degree, over years of intermixing, you did wind up with a certain genetic commonality as well. Although that's not quite as important. It's more the cultural. Now, the thing is, after World War II, you had movements that sought to bring Arabs together, and often they were not necessarily religious. The leaders of these movements were often educated in Europe. They were Muslim, but they were Muslim with a little m, if you know what I mean. They tended to be secular. They tended to like the ideas of socialism. And to a certain degree, they could see the commonalities between socialism and a kind of a communal sense of seeing things, and Islam. At the same time, the thing is that Christianity, too, can also see a certain connection with socialism. So you can see that whole let's share and look after each other and that sort of thing, which, it's a certain commonality, and I'm not going to go into the distinction between how secular socialism and Christian socialism tend to be much different than each other. But anyway, you had a lot of movements starting in the Middle East that were Arab nationalist, and they were socialist in orientation. Now, the interesting thing about this is that movements such as that of Nasser in Egypt, they tended to get the attention of the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union, they were interested in getting allies, just like the United States was interested in getting allies. And when someone like Nasser would talk about nationalism, which the communists weren't really into, but they would then talk about a socialist ideal and setting up institutions in their society that looked socialist on the outside, then the Russians were like, oh, well, let's go make friends with Mr. Nasser. You could take a look at the building of the Aswan Dam, for instance, and, how the Russians or the Soviets had a hand in that. But ultimately, it would be a mistake to see these as Soviet client states. Although in those days, the West tended to look with suspicion towards any movement that tried to incorporate a little bit of socialism in it. And the Soviets, they looked with delight when someone was kind of flirting with socialism. Now again, Nasser was the kind of person who he believed that Arabs should unify, and that would give them a certain strength in the world. And again, now there's something else. Here's a guy talking about socialism. Here's a guy talking about unity of the Arab world. American government, they're getting a little concerned about stuff like that. And so anyway, the movements such as Nasser in Egypt, these movements tended to be popular with military people, which would eventually lead someone like Gaddafi to lead a revolt and take over the country of Libya under those same kinds of ideals. And the Ba'ath Party of Iraq and Syria primarily, all of these were movements that could essentially be said to be Arab nationalism. At the same time, not just there, but in the early 50s, you had the Iranians who, they elected a government, a democratic election. They elected a government of someone who was just like, let's pull Iran together and, Iranian oil for Iranians and stuff like that. So the CIA held a coup. They organized some nation changing there. Remind you of some of these color revolts nowadays? Those are just organic, just started, within their populations. Sure, right. So anyway, the CIA organized the revolt that overthrew the democratically elected government, and they installed the Shah. And the Shah was, yay, I'll do what the West wants me to. And he went about a policy of, military power, but he was very brutal, and also, towards his own people, and also a certain sense of secularism. Now, secularism tends to be more popular, just like in Europe. And what I mean by secularism is kind of separating religion from politics. The governments of Egypt under Nasser, and later Gaddafi, and Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and at the time not Bashir Assad, his father, Hafez al-Assad. These individuals believed that being Arab was kind of number one. Religion, in those days there used to be lots of Christian Arabs. George Bush kind of put an end to that with the Iraq invasion, and Obama's been doing his best to lower those numbers as well. The thing is that these governments looked at you as being more of, like I said, an Arab first, religion second. And so in that sense, they had religious tolerance to a degree. In Iraq, Saddam was a Sunni, and he tended to not really like Shia. So ironically, he actually wound up with Christians rising to very high levels in the Iraqi government. But he did not trust Shia, even though they were the majority of the country. So anyway, along with this secularism, you wound up with women getting equality. You wound up with, if you look at pictures of these countries back in the 50s, you're like, whoa, things have really changed. Women didn't cover their faces and so forth. It was starting to look very Western. And there was universal education, that sort of thing. At least it was promoted. Didn't mean everyone got an education, but it was promoted. Now, the thing is, the West, again, kind of looked at a lot of these movements with suspicion. They were worried that these movements could be used to forge alliances that might not be good for Western interest. So the West tended to look down on these countries. And of course, these countries, because A, they tended to be a little bit socialist, and B, because, the West was looking down upon them, started gravitating towards the Soviet Union to buy weapons and do these kinds of things. I'll get to Israel in just a minute. Anyway, the thing, you had something going on in Saudi Arabia, though. Now, Saudi Arabia, very interesting country, very conservative, and they have a form of Islam known as Wahhabism. And I guess I would compare Wahhabism basically to Islam as I would compare being Amish to regular Christianity, or any other number of sects that tend to be very, let's get back to the basics. So Wahhabism believes in a very strict observance of Islam, a very strict, the most, looking basically at any Islamic scripture in the Quran or the Hadith, and seeing that as, the most strict interpretation you can have towards it. And so, the people that took over Saudi Arabia, they took over, getting help from the Wahhabists, and then the king he purged, and that was put it nicely, purged many of the people who had actually helped bring him to power. But the Saudi situation is precarious, and it's been that way for a long time. The royal family and the inner circle are a small part of Saudi population. Now, it's very influential because they control the oil. But there's always these fears that this Arab nationalism, could actually wind up toppling them. You get some military person somewhere deciding he's going to pull what later Gaddafi did in Libya, and have a coup and wind up with Saudi Arabia being a secular government, or worse yet, communist. And so the Saudi royal family had two things to worry about. One was that they were worried about, again, all this Arab nationalism / socialism that was going on. And they were also worried about the very, very hardcore, strict Wahhabists that were even more hardcore than they. And so they sort of started a policy. They wanted to contain communism. They were scared of communism and socialism. And they were kind of scared of the idea that they could get overthrown by religious leaders. So what they started doing was, first, they made alliances with the United States. America needed oil. This goes back to meetings that were held back in the 1940s with Franklin Roosevelt. But the Saudis needed, the West needed oil. It needed supplies that were readily available and, were not threatened. So deals were made with the Saudis that the West, particularly the United States, would protect the ruling elite of Saudi Arabia in exchange for, various financial deals I'll go into in just a minute. But essentially, it was a symbiotic relationship. The Saudis had oil, America had weapons. So, you could protect them. At the same time, the Saudis started funneling a lot of money into building mosque and madrasas. Madrasa just means school, but these were very religious schools. And this could satisfy some of the very extreme conservatives that they're building all of these institutions around the world, at that time mostly centered in the Middle East. Later it would start going out to, countries like America and Europe and so forth. But this gave the Saudis a certain level of influence in that, you build it, you have some kind of a say in who gets to be the people that are going to lead it. Who's going to develop the curriculum in a school? Who's going to be in charge of the services in the mosque? And so Wahhabism, this very strict form of Islam, started getting exported throughout the world. It's sort of the same way America works. America. Well, no. Let's not use America as an example. Let's use the old, idea that the British used to fund missionary schools around the world. And, people in local tribes that maybe had they weren't Christian, would go to these schools. They would learn about math and science, and they'd also learn about British government and British norms and British religion. So in many ways, this is how the British Empire extended its cultural influence all over the world, as well as religious influence. And this is what the Saudis were doing and are doing, that you can spread this vision of how Islam should be throughout the entire world. And, of course, that has changed the dynamics of the region considerably. But they thought this would be a good way to counter any sort of communism coming in, and to a degree probably keep the nationalists in check. Even though you could say they also kind of helped out. They didn't see the nationalists as big a threat as they did the communists. Now, going back to Europe and the United States, this continuous Cold War bickering, the Russians continued helping out their friends. The Americans were doing their best to subvert those movements that were communist, as well as help their friends in the Middle East. Now, I should mention Israel. Israel, when the war took place in 1967, no, okay, let's go back. When Israel first was established in 1948 officially, the Arab countries around it declared war on it. Now, I will note that at that time, both America and the Soviet Union sent arms to Israel so they could defend themselves. Okay? I mean, that's something most people forget. The Soviet Union helped them too. But as time went on, the Soviets started seeing that a division was taking place in the Arab countries, and that I guess everyone kind of thought after that initial war, everything would just kind of go back to normal. Israel would have its little plot of land. The Arabs would just kind of like, oh, well, all right. And everything would just be okay. Obviously, they didn't calculate right. But then the Russians started a program in which they started, getting in there and getting friendly with the Arab countries and distancing themselves to a large degree from Israel. I don't think it had anything to do with religion per se. I think it had more to do with, this is an opportunity for us to go in there and get some influence. And you had countries like, Iraq, for one, as I said earlier, Egypt, and also Syria, in which a lot of what you'd call the intelligentsia of those societies, their children, or just the influence of people's children, often went and were schooled in the Soviet Union. Okay, just like many people in Latin America from highly influential families would send their kids to the United States to be schooled, or in Asia and Africa would send their kids to London or Paris to get schooled. Now, this built ties to the Soviet Union, and many of the reasons why Russia and Syria are so close today is because of those ties that were built by Hafez Assad with the Soviets. But anyway, this antagonism started growing, and when the war took place in the early 70s, the Saudis figured that maybe they did have one way of influencing the world. They didn't have the weapons to defeat Israel. They didn't have the ability to really use diplomacy because, face it, the United Nations, the 5 big superpowers, or at least at that time, and, you have 5 major countries that can veto anything. I mean, you can come through with all kinds of resolutions, but they don't have any binding influence on anyone. They have just one country like the United States, or at that time Soviet Union, or England, if they veto it. But the one thing they had was oil. And they raised the price. And they later put an embargo on. For those too young to remember it, you used to be able to only buy gasoline in the United States on an odd or even day. When OPEC was formed, and with the Saudis pretty much in control, they had an incredible amount of influence because they could threaten if a country wasn't following the foreign policy in regards to the Arab-Israeli situation. They could kind of cut the oil. So you started seeing many European countries that had been like, really, yay, Israel, suddenly like, well, maybe we need to look at this more even-handedly. Whereas you saw the United States, which was not quite as dependent on oil from the region, they were able to continue with a very pro-Israeli standpoint. Now, there was one thing, though, that Nixon was able to secure with the Saudi Arabians that not too many people are aware of, and that is, but it affects every one of you today, even if you live in Europe and stuff, but especially in America. And that's the whole petrodollar thing, where the Saudis agreed that when selling oil, the unit of exchange would be the US dollar. And because of that, this allows the dollar to have a much greater value than you would think its worth would entail. This allows the United States to borrow much more money nowadays. This allows the United States to have that good faith and credit sort of ideal. And then to go out and, basically, we can't pay our bills. Would you like to buy some treasury notes? Now, the thing is, again, this also meant that America was in a situation where they had to be friendly with Saudi Arabia. Now, I'm going to fast forward this a little bit, but between, this starting in this period, the 1970s and especially the 1980s, the Saudis placed a lot of the, because they were getting way more money now. Way more. They raised the price of gas and figure, okay, we can determine the price of oil if we get all the OPEC nations, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, to agree with each other on how much to pump out of the ground, therefore keeping the supply-demand equation in their favor. So you don't put the price too high, because then you encourage people from around the world to find other sources of energy. Too low and you don't make as much money as you want. So what happened was the Saudis started making tens of billions of dollars. This is a small country. And so they put their money in banking institutions. Now these Western banks suddenly wind up with all this money. Well, this enables them to start developing much more power and influence in society. The banking institutions were not quite as powerful in the West as many people might think back in, 1940s, especially in the United States. Roosevelt clipped their wings quite a bit. But usually you had a large number of banks. They were not monopolistic. They didn't have an incredible amount of influence as an industry. And then all of a sudden now they get all this money. Instead of maybe being a small building in New York, suddenly they're a big skyscraper in New York. And this enabled them to start lobbying Congress and Senate for changes in laws. And of course, in the 1990s, that meant the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, and a lot of other regulations that had kept the banks kind of under control in the United States. Now, as this continued, as this policy continued with Saudis getting lots of oil, then you wound up with countries like the United States, Britain, and many others wanting, as during this time period, Asia started winding up with a lot of industry. This would only be accelerated during the 1990s when Clinton changed the laws and allowed for very, very low tariffs with China. But anyway, the process had been going underway anyway. We're in the 1970s, late 1970s, and then the 80s, you saw a kind of a deindustrialization of countries like Britain and the United States. But the one thing you could sell would be weapons. Now, if the Saudis are so afraid of their position in the world, they started buying lots of weapons. And, that gave them a great deal of influence. If they say no to a weapons deal, all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And many of these weapons manufacturers are companies that you don't even think of as being involved in weapons. They may only make certain components for those weapons, but they still make tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, even though you never think of that company as being a defense industry. Okay? And, the military has an incredible amount of influence in the United States. If you don't believe me, check the connection between the military and Hollywood. You think that whenever they use military equipment in a movie, that's cheap? It's cheap for the movie producers because they make deals. But the military then has a right to go over the scripts. So, believe me, the military has a great deal of influence in the United States that you don't understand. The industries that make money off of military hardware, they have a lot of influence. And as many of these countries around the Middle East, not just Saudi Arabia, but later you would get other countries as well, with their oil revenues, they were wanting to buy weapons. And, that gave them a lot of leverage in politics in the Western world. And so ultimately, what you wind up with then is, let's just look at the Saudis. The Saudis are influencing with a lot of their money. They're able to build institutions which allow them to have more cultural influence in those various countries that they build those institutions in. They have a great deal of money invested in European and American banks. They buy tons of materials from the West, including, weapons and that sort of thing. And so Saudi Arabia becomes and also the petrodollar. Don't forget the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia winds up with an incredible, relationship with countries like the United States. At the same time, you have what's maybe a contradictory relationship. The United States is very strongly connected to Israel and is dedicated to protecting Israel in case, these very large countries around it in population compared to its population were to attack. Now, on the other hand, you get a situation occur where in the, the late 1970s, Afghanistan. Now, I remember this, I don't know if it was the Peace Corps or something, where they had this cartoon, and this is when I was a little kid, and there was this cartoon that would come on urging people to join like the Peace Corps. I think it was the Peace Corps. It could have been one of the others, but it's like this guy comes in and he's like, I want to go help. And he gives this one really exotic, beautiful country he wants to go to. And the guy at the desk says, nah, you're going to Afghanistan. And, I was like, where the heck is Afghanistan? And I looked it up and it was like this really isolated area of the world. Wish most Americans would do that nowadays and know where the countries are. But anyway, I look up Afghanistan, but I had no idea what was going on there. What was going on there was a very turbulent situation. I'm not going to go into all the tribal disputes and so forth taking place, but you have a lot of tribes there that vie for power and influence. And the government that did wind up taking control during the late 70s was favorable to the Soviet Union. Problem was the Soviet Union didn't really like this guy, so they got rid of him. But then they installed someone else. Now, the thing is, they wanted to turn Afghanistan into this, turning it from a very rural and backward nation. They wanted to turn it into a nation that would extol. They wanted to turn the nation into something that would extol the virtues of communism, because communism wasn't doing so great in the Soviet Union. I mean, because they were getting all this, people were getting TV broadcast from Europe, and the Russians and the Eastern Europeans could see how good people had it in in Europe, or at least a vision of how good they had it in Europe. And they were realizing that they were sort of like being left behind. And the Soviet leaders needed to infuse a little bit more pride into the religion of communism. So they decided they were going to make Afghanistan into this wonderful little communist republic. At the same time, some of the more militant mujahideen, they'd later be called mujahideen, had escaped into countries like Pakistan. Now, the United States saw this as a really good opportunity to chip away at the Soviets. So during the Carter administration, Zbigniew Brzezinski went over and started kind of pushing the idea of the mujahideen going in there and, fighting for their land and their God and so forth. Now, a lot of people think, well, this was only after the Soviets had taken over the country and were fighting the mujahideen. No, actually, Brzezinski went over before the fights all started. Okay? And this may have been, I don't know, it was kind of a cynical, calculated move in which you forced the Soviets to have to come in and maybe wind up in their own Vietnam. As the Americans have been drawn into Vietnam, maybe draw the Soviets into the same situation. And America, of course, was still in that demoralized, anti-military state. And if you remember back in the 70s, if you're old enough. And so a lot of this was kept secret. Okay, this was before the whole idea of nation building and basically feeling like you had not only the right but the duty to go in and start fixing everyone's problems. And because Vietnam had left a very sour taste in people's mouths in the United States. But anyway, what happened was that the Mujahideen did go in, and then later, a little bit later, Reagan supported them. And you wound up supporting a lot of elements out of Saudi Arabia. The government of Saudi Arabia was happy to see him go, because this took off some of the pressure that they were kind of worried about. And you had people like Osama bin Laden, going over there and joining in on the American effort to take out these godless Soviet invaders of Afghanistan. Even though you got to say that bin Laden, he was not an Afghan, he was an Arab. And many of the fighters in the Mujahideen were not actually Afghans, but rather people going in there to fight. Very similar to what's going on with ISIS today. You probably have almost every nationality on earth, or at least people with passports from those countries, represented in ISIS. So anyway, the Soviets wind up bogged down in a war that they just cannot win. Okay? It's a guerrilla war, and finally they just say, forget it, and they leave. Of course, the demoralization, the humiliation of losing, because everyone before had thought, the invincible Soviet army. When they're defeated there, it starts a process by which the Soviet Union collapses eventually. When you had that connected to the religious uprisings of the Catholics in Poland, the Soviets were no longer this invincible force. And so, of course, communism collapsed. Now, the thing that should be remembered in all of this is the United States. The United States was actually trying to maneuver itself through all of this to try to get the best situations for them. And so in many cases, the United States would go into countries like Iraq and try to be friends with, later Saddam. And because they kind of thought that, Saddam's anti-communist, even though he has certain elements of socialism, so let's try to be friends with him. But Saddam was very good at playing the Soviets and the Americans off against each other, especially since the Americans were so scared of Iran. They still were really, really, really ticked off at the Iranians taking the U.S. embassy back in what was it, 1970? Was it 78 or 79? I don't really remember which. But anyway, the situation you had there, though, that few people I don't think understand, is Saddam wanted to pay off all of his debts and get Iraq on its feet and no longer have to be obligated to anyone. And so he started pumping oil at a lower price than the OPEC countries wanted. And this created a situation where, well, Saddam didn't really get along very well with the OPEC countries. And I mean, the Saudis. And here he is trying to undermine them. At the same time, he thinks, now this is what he said, he thinks the Kuwaitis, who are more aligned with Saudi Arabia, were horizontal pumping. That is, you think about these oil wells that could go thousands and thousands of feet deep, that they were pumping from oil underneath Iraqi territory. So anyway, without going into a lot of the Saddam thinking, America gave approval for him to invade Kuwait. He invades Kuwait. Of course, George Bush pushes him back. And then the Saudis are a little nervous, so they allow the Americans to put bases in Saudi territory. Well, this is going to really infuriate the the ones that are highly religious conservatives in Saudi Arabia, people that are very similar to Osama bin Laden. So instead of Osama being kind of like, yay America when it came to attacking the Russians, he condemns this and actually threatens and says, you guys got to move this, you got to move out. You got to take your bases out of here. And of course America didn't, and that's when Osama started his encouraging this campaign, usually through his financial backings, encouraging various terrorist activities. I will note that Saddam Hussein was very much against Al-Qaeda. His government was very, very secular and very opposed. And of course, Tony Blair and George Bush made it sound like that, he was kind of connected to the Twin Towers and that sort of thing, and Americans were ready for revenge, and Bush was able to direct that revenge. Now, this meant that eventually, Iraq loses the war. And then you wind up in a situation in which, Iraq is devastated. But America starts kind of getting this idea that maybe we can kind of, we got Afghanistan, we got Iraq. Let's start toppling all these other countries. Let's start encouraging the regime change. And this is what eventually would lead to the destruction of Libya. Big propaganda campaign, Gaddafi's doing this. Later it comes out, no, he didn't do that. But it didn't make any difference. It's easier to ask forgiveness than it is permission. So, Gaddafi's gone. Libya's a mess. Syria, kind of the same thing, but it didn't work out the way it was planned. It was planned that, Assad would be overthrown, with all of this, Gulf state money going in to fund these various groups. And many of these groups later, it would be found out were like Al-Qaeda. A branch of them, wound up becoming ISIS. And then you wind up with a situation where you don't really have much left of that free Syrian army that you hear like John McCain going, yay, the freedom fighters and all this kind of stuff. There's not much left of them. Many of them just go ahead and go join those guys. And so essentially what you have here is some of the people that formed these organizations got their fighting experience fighting Americans in Iraq. Because even though, when Saddam was thrown out, they went in and, this was enemy and my enemy is my friend type situation. They go in and start fighting with the American and British forces. They get battle experience. They go to Libya. They fight Gaddafi. After he's gone, they go over and fight Assad. And they're getting all these weapons. Much of the time, the vetting process is not very good. And, we're for sure. We're for all peace and democracy. So you give them weapons, then you find out you've given the wrong people the weapons, and, there's problems. And this is what leads us to where we're at today. These guys have gotten out of hand. ISIS is no longer controllable by the Saudis or anyone else, even though they've helped these various organizations to overthrow. Now, the Gulf states feel like, oh my gosh, ISIS could actually come after us. You got a situation where America, it has no control over these various factions in Syria. And Turkey is in the same boat, but everyone's been playing this Machiavellian game of, our group here will help out, we'll oppose this other group. And it turns it into a giant battlefield, which now just everyone's over there bombing the heck out of it. And who knows what's going to happen. And, but the infrastructure of these countries is destroyed. And that leads us where we're at today. We've got a chaos, but it's a worldwide chaos, because this is not going to be isolated, I don't think, in these regions. At least that's not what the people that are the organizers of these terrorist things are saying. They said they're going to take this war all over the place. And I hope they're not. I hope they're just spouting off. I hope they're not right. I hope they don't do anything like France again. I wouldn't necessarily bet that they won't. But the thing is, people should try to understand this and try to understand that this is not something that just sprang up when people started, fighting against whatever government was in Iraq after Saddam was ousted. This is not something that just you can't just say, oh yeah, well, okay, it's George Bush's fault, because even though he has responsibility for some of it, not all of it. Obama, yeah, I mean, everything that's happened since 2008, he's been supporting and facilitating. But ultimately, Bush, Obama, they have actually done a big mess with a lot of stuff over there. Donald Trump comes up and says, well, maybe he's been better at Saddam and Gaddafi were still alive and in charge. I don't see how you can argue against that if you're talking about, well, what would have been better in this situation right now that we're in. Well, anyway, but, take a look at some of the history, see what's going on out there, and encourage your friends to do so, because America is a historically illiterate nation, with some people knowing a whole lot. Most of them read alternative media, and a lot of people not even knowing what countries to the south and to the north. So maybe if more and more people knew what was going on, we would have a more coherent foreign policy being demanded by the constituents upon their congressmen and senators and president. Anyway, that's enough on history tonight, and thank you for tuning in to this evening's edition of Unlock the Radio here on UTY TV Productions.